theyeshiva.net.
One of the important truths to know about Torah and about the structure of Chamisha Chumshei Torah and the Tanakh is that the Torah rarely describes the emotional state of the characters whose stories it is describing. The emotional states of the characters we have to somehow deduce on our own from the story. Sometimes it's implicit, sometimes all we can do is speculate. Even stories that are powerfully dramatic, the story is told, what happened, in terms of the inner emotions and experiences and thoughts and feelings of the people involved, it is rarely portrayed, and it is portrayed only when that emotion is relevant to the story itself. It's relevant to the narrative itself. An example, Yosef is thrown into the pit by his brothers. He comes close, they plot to kill him, he doesn't know that. He approaches them, they remove that colorful tunic that his father has bought him as a sign, a demonstration of love. And they take this boy, 17 years old, and collectively they cast him into a boir, a pit, a cave, a cistern, which is empty, no water. What was he feeling? What was he experiencing? Did he respond? Did he say anything? In the story itself, Yosef is silent. We know nothing about his emotions. We know the facts, not the feelings. Later, and this is very surprising because here, the Torah does describe the emotions, but only later. In Parshas Miketz, 2 decades later, more than 2 decades later, 21 years later, when the brothers come down to Egypt to purchase food, and the prime minister of Egypt, who is of course their lost brother Yosef, recognizes them and accuses them of espionage and incarcerates them for 3 days, and then tells them that they can go home, but one brother has to remain in prison till they come back with their baby brother Binyamin. They turn to each other and they say, Ashemim anachnu, we're guilty. This is not the prime minister's evil doing. This is our evil doing. Why? Ashemim anachnu, we're guilty. Because this tzara, they say, came because we did not listen to the cry of our brother. This is 21 years ago. Excuse me. The words that they say is, Ashemim anachnu alachinu, asher ra'inu tzaras nafshoy b'yischanenu eleinu v'loy shamanu, al kein ba aleinu hatzara hazois. Quite potent words. Our brother, we have seen the distress of his soul when he begged us, when he pleaded with us, and we did not listen. We were indifferent, we were apathetic. That's why 20 years later, we're dealing with this tzara, with this terrible, stressful situation that has befallen us here in Egypt. So suddenly, 20 years later, we find out not only was Yosef emotional, he was actually expressive. He was begging his brothers, don't do this to me. And they didn't listen. Why wouldn't the Torah tell this in the story itself? Because the Torah usually doesn't say these things in the story. Here it becomes relevant that the brothers are blaming themselves for not responding to a brother's plea. So we have to know that he was pleading and they didn't respond to it and they felt guilty over it. And in fact, some commentators say they didn't even feel guilty over the fact that they sold him. They felt that they did the right thing based on their understanding of who he was. They felt guilty that they did not express compassion to his pleas, whether he was guilty or not. That's what some of the famous Mefarshim say. Adam and Chava watch one of their sons murder another son. The first family in history confronts homicide. One brother kills another brother. What did they feel like? I don't know. I don't know. What did Noach feel like when he comes out of the Teva and he sees the flood destroyed all of humanity? I don't know. I know he got drunk. Maybe that can tell you what he felt like. Okay, fine. So we speculate. Yitzchak is bound up on the altar. His father is about to slaughter him. He takes the sword to slaughter his son before the angel calls and says, Avram, al tishlach yadcha. What did Yitzchak feel like? What did Avram feel like? The Torah is silent. The story is so loaded. In a regular book, lahavdil, a regular novel you would write, a story of reality, of history, or a fiction, any author would put that in. Any writers here? You would leave out such a point? Figure it out. What did Yitzchak feel like after he found out that Rivka concocted a maisa and dressed up one son like the other brother to take the blessings? What did he feel like? What was that conversation like? What did Yaakov feel like when he discovered that he married the wrong woman? What would you feel like if you discovered you married the wrong man? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I can imagine. The Torah is silent. It just says he went to Lavan and says, why did you deceive me? The Midrash reports that there was a whole conversation between him and Leah. We once spoke about it. Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel, Midrash Rabbah, a whole shmuz was between him and Leah. Where do we see a feeling? We see a feeling when Yaakov is going back to the Holy Land, to Canaan, after 2 decades of separation from his father and mother. He was by Lavan, he got married, he built a family, he's on the way back, he wants to make peace with his brother, he sends a message of reconciliation, the message comes back, the messengers come back and say what? Your brother is coming with 400 troops against you, Arba Meyasish, 400 soldiers, 400 troops to attack you. At that moment the Torah says, Vayira Yaakov Ma'oid. There's an emotion. Yaakov is terrified. He's not afraid, he's excessively afraid. Vayitzer loy, he's distressed. But there the emotion is the story. Because what's the next step? He splits up the camp into 2. He says if one gets killed, the other one will escape. And then he prays and he begs of God to save him. And that's not enough. He prepares a lavish bribe and gift to send to his brother, many animals to perhaps appease his wrath and calm his anger, his ire. So why is he doing all of this? Nothing happened tangibly yet, but he's responding to an emotion. So the emotion is extremely relevant to the story. And you'll see this throughout the whole Chumash. Stories are told. Facts are related. Not all facts, but certain facts. Key facts of the story. The feelings, the experiences, the inner turmoil and thoughts, unless it is the story, it will not be there even though it obviously happened. People have been feeling from day one. It's part of the human composition. It's part of the animal composition. Which is why, when you see an exception to that rule, any serious student, their antennas must go up and try to understand what caused this exception. Such an exception exists in the opening of Parsha Shmos. In Parsha Shmos, which begins, of course, the second book, the second sefer, the second volume of the 5 Chumashim, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, a new era begins in the life of the family of the Jewish people. Until this point, we focused on the patriarchs, the matriarchs, and their children, and their relocation from Canaan into Egypt. Bereshis ends on the final note, the final verse, that Yosef, the prime minister of Egypt, and the one who invited his siblings and his family and fed them and nurtured them and protected them, passes away in Egypt at the age of 110. And now begins the new era of new generations emerging, where all the brothers, Yaakov passed already earlier, but all the brothers passed away. Yosef and all of his brothers passed away, and the entire generation has passed on, and now the generations continue. And as the Galus Mitzrayim, the subjugation of the Jewish people, takes root, in the beginning, we talk about the Jewish people collectively. There is a nation here, a large nation, a nation that is blossoming and fruitful in extraordinary ways, unexpectedly. And Parai and his people subjugate them. And then we are introduced to the birth of a young boy named Moshe. Moshe, as you know, doesn't grow up among the Jewish people. He grows up in the palace. He grows up as an adopted son of the daughter of Pharaoh, from all people, Batya. And the first story we know about Moshe, in terms of him taking an initiative, the first opening story is in Perek Beis, chapter 2, verse 11. The Torah now introduces for the first time Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of, before we learned about him as a baby, being taken care of, being nursed by his mother, being adopted by the princess. In terms of Moshe himself, the first story is Vayihi bayamim hahem vayigdal Moshe vayetze elechav. During those days, Moshe grows up and he goes out to his brothers. He goes out, of course, because he's naturally not with his brothers. He has been privileged to live a life not only of prosperity, but of royalty, of aristocracy, growing up with the daughter of Parai as his mother. So he goes out physically, geographically, but he also goes out conceptually, going out from his royal, comfortable, prosperous cocoon, where all of his needs are not only met, but he is provided for with the greatest prosperity and broadness and wealth. He goes out to brothers who are suffering, vayarbesiv loisam. He sees their suffering. And the first scene is, he sees an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew, as the Torah puts it. Vayar ish mitzri, make ish ivri meyachav. An Egyptian man is beating, smiting, striking a Hebrew man, a Jewish man, me'echav, of one of his brothers. And the Torah, of course, mentions one of his brothers to help give context to the story. And Moshe sees the scene. And according to most commentators, although it says the word makkah literally means hitting. In Chumash it sometimes means murderous hitting. One can hit, one can spank somebody, and one can beat somebody trying to beat them to death, or close to death. Vayifen kai v'chai, Moshe looks here, he looks there, vayar ki ein ish, and he sees that there is no man. Vayaches hamitzri, the word vayach is used again, and here obviously it means he kills the Egyptian, he strikes him dead, vayitmeneu b'choil, and he buries him in the sand, he hides him in the sand. That's the first story and episode we know about Moshe. This is our first introduction to the man. The first action of his life is, he comes out, he sees an innocent Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian, beaten to death. He kills the perpetrator, he kills the murderer, and he saves the victim. Vayetze bayoyim hasheni. He comes out on the second day. And suddenly he sees two Jewish men quarreling with each other. In contrast to day one, now day two, there's a different story. Two Hebrew men, Shnei Anashim Ivrim, they're also killing each other, or beating each other, or quarreling, nitzim, they're fighting with each other. Again, he uses the word saka for the third time. He tells one of the men, a wicked man, why are you beating, why are you hitting, you're smiting your friend? And the response of this person who was hitting his friend, or about to hit his friend, he turns to Moshe, and this is the first thing Moshe would have heard from a Jew. Because yesterday the Jew was being beaten to death. We don't know if he spoke. He probably said thank you afterwards. But the second day, when Moshe tells this Jew, why are you beating your friend? He says, Wer hat dir gemacht for a balabas? And he didn't speak in Yiddish. He said, Mi samcha leish sar v'shayfet aleinu. Who died and made you king, as the expression goes? Who turned you into a ruler and judge over us? Whoever gave you this position to think that you can rule over us and judge our actions and tell me why ask me why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's not enough for Moshe to get the message. He says, Halahargeni ata omer kasher haraktes hamitzri. Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? I know that yesterday you've killed the Egyptian who was hitting a Jew. Are you now going to do the same thing? Here the Torah says, Vayira Moshe. Moshe became afraid. Vayomer, and he said, Achein noida hadavar. The thing has become known. The thing. Literally, which thing? That which has happened yesterday has become known. He turned here and there and saw there was nobody there. He thought innocently, nobody saw what happened. Now when this Jew tells him, who turned you into a minister and a judge, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? First thing is, he's afraid. The second thing is, he says, it's known. It became known. An emotion of Moshe. He's feeling fear. He's feeling trepidation. What happened at this time? The man told him, you're going to kill me? And Moshe is frightened. Next scene. Vayishma Paroi es hadavar hazeh. Paroi indeed hears about this thing. Moshe said, this thing became known. Which thing? That I killed the Egyptian. Paroi hears this thing. He hears the news. Vayevakesh laregas Moshe. He now seeks to kill Moshe. Vayivrach Moshe mipnei Paroi, vayeshev beretz Midyan, vayeshev ala be'er. So Moshe flees from the Pharaoh, from Paroi, his step Zeda, his step grandfather, and he runs to Midyan. He dwells in Midyan and he dwells by the well. And the story continues, him encountering the 7 daughters of Yisro and assisting them. That's the third story. The third story is, as he's by the well of Midyan, he sees there are 7 girls there, the daughters of Yisro. They're trying to irrigate the flock of their father by the well, taking water from the well and perhaps putting it in the trough and irrigating the sheep of the father. And the shepherds come and expel and harass these women. And Moshe stands up and he saves them and he irrigates their sheep. That's the third story about Moshe, which ends up in his marriage. This itself is quite interesting. These are the only 3 stories we know about Moshe before the action begins. If we want to paint a picture of the man, personality, character, spirituality, dedication, humility, wisdom, etc., there's only 3 stories to sketch his profile. Because the next story is he gets married, he becomes the shepherd of his father-in-law's flock, and the next scene, he meets God at the burning bush, and he's appointed to become the first leader, the first redeemer, the first Rebbe, the first shepherd of the Jewish people and liberate them from Egypt. Moshe is then a completely transformed human being, from a private citizen, from a shepherd, into Moshe Rabbeinu. So if one wonders, why was he chosen from all people? The Torah doesn't give a reason for this. It's interesting. There were many Jews. The Torah says there were many, many Jews. Why Moshe? Why Moshe? Why he? The Midrash says because he was a shepherd, and the fact that it says he was a shepherd represented his character. If you look in the Chumash itself, there's 3 stories about him. That's it. And those 3 stories tell you enough of what you have to know in order to at least have some appreciation of why Moshe was chosen. And all 3 stories have the same common denominator. They all have one common denominator. And what is that? He stands up. He stands up to injustice, brutality, narcissism, murderous instincts, oppression, and subjugation of innocent person. The first story, he stands up to an Egyptian murdering a Jew just because he's Jewish. In the second story, it's not an Egyptian against a Jew. It's a Jew against a Jew. So you would think Moshe would say, okay, now I'm mixing out. No. Vayomer LaRasha, why are you hitting him? And in the third story, he stands up for women. This is 3,500 years ago. Today it's popular. 3,500 years ago, he stands up women not from his tribe, not from his nation. The first time he's protecting a Jew. You could say, it's my people against the enemy. The second time it's a Jew against a Jew. Now he's in a strange land, none of his business. He's not part of local politics. Does he know what happened between these girls and these guys, between their father? He should say, it's none of my business, let me investigate. No, he stands up and he expels the shepherds and he saves the women. But here's the question. The emotion of fear by Moshe is displayed, and it doesn't seem to be part of the narrative. Why? If the Torah would say, the man told Moshe, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian, and Moshe becomes frightened, like, oh my God, somebody knows, and he runs away. That makes sense. If the Torah wouldn't say he was afraid, you wouldn't understand why he ran away. Just to say, the man said, you're going to kill me, Moshe ran away. Why did he run? He was afraid. He was feeling fear. Once somebody knows, you know how it is. Aznayim l'kaisel, even the wall has ears. Certainly people have ears. One person knows, it's like telling the secret to your best friend. And therefore, and here wasn't his best friend, so he tells him the story, he tells him that he knows, Moshe is afraid and he runs away. That's not what happened. Moshe didn't run away. Vayishma Paroi. Paroi heard the news and he tried to kill Moshe, then Moshe ran away. In other words, if Paroi would have not heard the news and Paroi would have not tried to kill him, the fact that this Jew knew that Moshe killed the Egyptian wouldn't be important enough for Moshe to run away. He only runs away after the king actually tries to execute him. If so, it seems that the depiction of Moshe's fear in the middle of the story is completely out of sync with the entire style of the entire Tanakh. Here you have a display of emotion that doesn't result in any activity. It's almost like describing an emotion lishma. Describing an emotion in order to describe the emotion without any consequences. Again, if the emotion would have resulted in an action of Moshe, it's the story. That is the sequence of the story. It does not. Moshe is afraid, and what happens next? Nothing. He's afraid. What happens next? He says, oh my God, it's known. What happens as a result of that? Nothing. It's an isolated, self-contained piece of the story that doesn't produce results. What happens next is Paroi hears the news and Paroi tries to kill him. Now Paroi heard the news because, as many commentators explain, because probably there's a Jew informed on him. So that is connected. The fact that the Jew told him, you're going to kill me, and then this Jew went to Paroi, if we assume this Jew told Paroi, which would be the sequence of the story, it would make sense. Rashi says that these Jews informed on Moshe to Paroi, that's how Paroi knew. But Moshe's fear in the middle of the story, is a complete chiddush. It's a novel concept in Chumash to describe an emotion of Moshe without an apparent result in action, because as I said, the fear did not cause him to run. It's Paro's trying to execute him that caused him to run. Now often when we read Chumash, we don't notice these things because we read it fast and we don't study the structure of the text, what is inserted, what is omitted, the style of how a story is told. But as I said, a serious student knows that this literally sticks out. And it's like, Vayira Moshe. Vayira Moshe. Just know he was afraid. And not only that, he spoke about it. He's like, wow, it's known. Unless we can go deeper and discover that this description of Moshe's fear is essential to the story. It's not just a description of an emotion so that our curiosity is filled by knowing what he was feeling, because if that was the case, there should be hundreds of other emotions described and they're all ignored. Not ignored, but just not explicit. Unless his fear is not just to satisfy the reader and say, okay, Moshe is afraid, good, he's just like me, or I'm just like him, but rather it's essential to the story. And for this, we're going to change the subject somewhat, and then Be'ezer Hashem come back to it and see one of the interpretations. How do we know that this is a difficult interpretation? So here you'll see another klal. If you look into Rashi, on the words Vayira Moshe, Moshe was afraid, Rashi says, Kipshutai. It means literally he was afraid. Then Rashi says, the Medrash said he was afraid because he said maybe this nation cannot be redeemed. If they have moisrim, informers on their own people, they can't be a people. They can't be a nation. If they are so fragmented and disintegrated, there's no cohesion, there's no loyalty. If they're ready to backstab each other like this, how can they be redeemed? That's what he was afraid of. Now Rashi writes many times, my job is ani loy basi lefarish ele pshutoy shel mikra. So once Rashi says, keep pshutoy, Moshe was afraid literally because somebody knew that he killed the Egyptian. Why does Rashi now have to add the Medrash? Because this is what was bothering Rashi. Why does the Torah describe his fear? So Rashi gives a second Midrashic interpretation that it's not literal. He wasn't afraid for himself. He wasn't afraid because of what this person said about him. He was generally afraid and distressed about the state of the Jewish nation, a whole different type of fear. It was a spiritual, transcendent fear of actually a leader, a whole different type of fear. But I want to go to the literal interpretation. The literal interpretation says that Moshe was afraid. How would we understand that? Rashi, you see what was compelling Rashi to give a whole, somewhat of a midrashic, a homiletical interpretation, not literal, that he's afraid about something else. He's afraid of the state of the nation because he's bothered why the Torah describes it, unless there's a reason to explain to us about Moshe's concerns. But if you say literally, like Rashi's first interpretation, how does it really come in here to the pasuk? There's a famous medrash in Parshas Vayishlach when it says that Yaakov was afraid when he heard that Esav was coming against him with 400 people. The Medrash Rabbah says that two people were afraid. Bachur sheba'avos and Bachur shebeneviim. The choicest of the patriarchs and the greatest of the prophets. Yaakov is afraid of Esav, and Moshe is also afraid in Parshas Chukas. Hashem tells Moshe, Al tira, don't be afraid of Sichain and Oig. Don't be afraid of Oig Melech HaBashan. In the Trans-Jordan, you're going to be able to defeat him and going to be able to conquer. Both are afraid. And many Mefarshim say that the Medrash is bringing out, obviously relative to their level, something of a subtle blemish in these two people, relative to their lofty spiritual heights, obviously. Why? They were afraid, say Chazal, Shema Yigrim Hachet. Even though God promised Yaakov, I'm going to be with you, and God promised Moshe, I'll be with you, what are you afraid? Why don't you trust God? They were afraid maybe their own inadequacies removed some of the protection. So Yaakov was afraid, Moshe was afraid. So why would the Medrash then criticize it? That would seem to be actually a very humble display, a display of humility. They're looking at themselves and they're saying, maybe we're unworthy. Which now brings us to the big topic, known in Judaism as bitachon, as trust. The concept of bitachon. There's a famous story, which I guess captures it in the most succinct fashion, about the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek, who's known by his Svarim, Tzemach Tzedek, was the grandson of the Baal HaTanya. He passed away in the year Tafresh Chavav, 1866, I stand corrected, 1866. He was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the third Rebbe in the Chabad dynasty. His name was Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, Schneerson, a grandson of the Baal HaTanya, his daughter's son. One of his Hasidim, whose name was Rebbe Michal Beliner, came to him once and said that his child is ill. His child is very ill. So the Tzemach Tzedek told him the 5 words in Yiddish. Tracht gut, wird sein gut. Think good, and it will be good. Think positive, and the results will be positive. And Reb Michal took that to heart. And he was thinking positive, that his child is going to be good, healthy. And his child recovered. That's the story about the Tzemach Tzedek. And this has become a quite well-known phrase. Today I think they already have songs and bracelets and whatever they have. But the original Yiddish expression of the Tzemach Tzedek was Tracht gut, wird sein gut. The Maggid of Mezrich, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, once said that the Navi Yecheskel, the prophet Yecheskel, says, Dmus kemara adam alav milmayla, in the famous vision of Yecheskel. He speaks about the fact that there is the Kisei HaKavod, the throne of glory, Udmus kemara adam alav milmayla. On the throne, there was an image that looked like a human being. And much of the Kabbalah tries to dissect those words that he describes Hashem sitting on the throne. It was an image, Kemara Adam, that looked like an Adam alav milmayla. The Kabbalah calls it Adam ha'elyon sha'al ha'kisei, the supernal human on top of the throne. Of course, doesn't mean a human as a physical human, but the way the way the great Kabbalists explain it is that the persona of man, which is comprised of 10 characteristics known as the 10 spheros, begins within the Godhead, within the divine. But the Maggid said something very intense. He said, Dmus kemara adam alav milmayla, that the image of the divine is always Mara Adam. It's a reflection of the image of the human being down here below. The divine face, so to speak, often mirrors the human face. So if I look in a mirror and I make a sour face, the face that's projected back to me is sour. You can try it out. If you look at the mirror and you show it a smiling face, the mirror projects back a smiling face. So the Maggid says that Yecheskel Hanavi is saying, the Dmus Milmayla, the divine image, Kevayachal, is Kemara Adam. It's a result, it's a reflection of the human countenance, of the human image. The midah, the emotion, the attitude, the perspective, the face, physical and emotional and spiritual, that the human being projects, that is mirrored in the divine. The Baal Shem Tov said, it says, we say in Tehillim, Hashem tzilcha. Hine layanam v'layishan shem Yisrael. Hashem shemrecha. Hashem tzilcha. Tehillim chapter 1:21. Thank you. God is your shadow. Literally, it means a shadow protects you. Today you don't mamish need a shadow. But a hot sunny day, you need other things. And a hot sunny day, the shadow you find refuge in the shadow. The Baal Shem Tov says something else. Hashem Tzilcha means God is your shadow. You remember when you're a child and you're walking Friday night, and one of the great activities of a child is to see how you move your leg, and the shadow moves with you. The shadow mimics. The shadow replicates. The shadow responds accurately to what you do. In fact, the shadow is a reflection of you. Said the Baal Shem Tov, Hashem Tzilcha. God is your shadow. Meaning, Hashem Kevayachal responds to me based on me. Dmus Kemara Adam Alav Mulmaila. There's a famous story in Gemara. Till now I brought other sources. The story in Gemara, Brachas, Daf Samach, the Gemara tells quite a fascinating story. There was a man named Yehuda, the son of Nasan. He was walking behind his teacher, Rav Hamnuna. Yehuda is walking behind Rav Hamnuna. Asnach, he gave a krechts, a sigh, a zifts in Yiddish. You know what a zifts is? It's the oi. You know that one? Asnach. So Reb Hamnuna looks and says, you want to bring pain into your life? Yisurim boya hi gavril asuya nafsha. You want to bring in pain into your life? And he quotes a pasuk from Iyov, Pachat pachadati vayesani rashayagorti yavoli. My fears actually produced results. So he asks him, Rebbe, Shlomo HaMelech says in Proverbs, Ashrei Adam mefachet tamid. Fortunate is the person who's always afraid. He says, please, ahu b'divrei Torah ksiv. That's talking about intellectual integrity when it comes to Torah. You should always be cautious and ask yourself, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I'm going to forget. Maybe I forgot, I have to review. That's a different type of fear. That's the fear of knowing how vulnerable, mortal, and frail a human being is, and always be cautious before you make decisions, especially when they're affecting many people's lives. But this is no excuse for you to sigh. What is the meaning of this? What was he saying here? The Maharal has a sefer called Nesivos Olam, and there he has a section called Nesiv HaBitachon, the path of bitachon, of trust. And there he discusses this. Other Mefarshim, Yefei Torah, Medrash Rabbah discusses this, and other sources. Another fascinating statement of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov said, when God wants to punish somebody, or I should say, cleanse somebody, he has to do one thing first. Take away the person's midas habitachon. If the person's midas habitachon, attribute of trust, is not taken away, nothing negative can befall the person. He has to first take away his midas habitachon. The pasuk says in Tehillim, "Haboiteach b'Hashem chesed yisayvevenu." Somebody who trusts in God, grace, kindness surrounds this person. Many psukim, B'tach b'Hashem, have bitachon in God. Many other verses. You go out to work, you say tzei lamalchama. Don't be stressed and terrified, which the Mefarshim Rabbeinu Yoina brings that as the main pasuk of bitachon. You got to trust it's going to be good. But let's now try to get down. What are all these sources telling us? What are they teaching us? There are two concepts. There's a concept called Emunah. There's a concept called bitachon. Some commentators throughout history associated them as being synonymous, associated them together, and said one is very similar to the other. But many commentators, many mefarshim, many sources, especially in the world of Nister, but even in the world of Gemara and Chazal and Medrash, at least according to many interpretations, saw them as two different realities. Emunah means faith. Bitachon means trust. In our context, Emunah is the idea that a person is aware that God runs the world. Hashem orchestrates every event in a person's life till the smallest detail. The famous line of the Baal Shem Tov that even a leaf falling off a tree on a cold day, if the tree still has some leaves today, and it falls off and it rolls and it lands in a particular place, that's also with divine providence. That's also with Hashgach. And they say that the Baal Shem Tov was once walking with his students and he was teaching this, and they said, Rebbe, here's this leaf. Could you explain to us what's the providence about this leaf being here and not there? He says, why don't you lift up the leaf and look what's under it? They lifted up the leaf and they saw a little worm. The Baal Shem Tov said this worm has been suffering under the scorching heat of the sun, and it was pleading with God to ease its agony. So the leaf came to create refuge for this little worm. Now in that case, they could see it. I see a leaf on the street, I'm not sure. I can always see it, but he was trying to bring out the point. That's even a leaf. So when it comes to a person's life, everything in a person's life is what we call hashgach, hashgacha pratis, which means detailed providence orchestrated. And even though so many things in life happen as a result of human behavior, you did this to me or you didn't do this to me, willingly or unwillingly. I lost my job because this one decided. I got a job because this one decided. I wasn't invited, I was invited. This happened because this one. I mean, everything in our life usually has causes. As a result of a doctor or a psychologist or a spouse or a relative or a friend or a community, whatever, there's always somebody or a stranger that causes so many things in our life. Not all, but so many things in our life. Nonetheless, the concept of Emunah is that ultimately there is one source. Even though God runs the world through many ambassadors and messengers and seaboys, reasons that cause it in reality, but there's ultimately one source responsible for it all, and therefore a Jew who has this Emunah is aware that even though it seems like this person is at fault or this person gets the credit, ultimately there's one source that is behind and in front and in middle of every experience that happened in the person's life from the first breath till their last breath, and before that and after that. Kol haneshama, kol neshimu neshima. And therefore, as a result of that, when somebody takes that seriously, there could be a certain serenity, a certain menuchas hanefesh, a certain tranquility, a certain serenity, because even if the person is confronting a difficult situation, the awareness that ultimately it's Hashem who is responsible for this situation, and knowing that God loves you, and loves you in the profoundest way. Haboicher ba'ama Yisrael ba'ahava, avas oilam ahaftanu, ahafti eschem amar Hashem, various psukim or parts of the tefillah. And like as the Baal Shem Tov said, that Hashem loves every Jew more than parents love a ben yachid, an only child who was born when they were already older and they thought they couldn't have children. And then they have one child. One can imagine the tremendous, infinite affection that a mother has to that child, even beyond the infinite love she has to every child. Says the Baal Shem Tov, the love of Hashem to every Jew is infinitely greater even than that love. So when a person could be aware of this on some level, it already creates a certain serenity, a certain menucha, an understanding that every challenge is an opportunity, and in every nisayon, in every difficulty, there is ultimately meaning, and it allows the person to rise above the situation. A few days ago, Reb Shalom Mordechai Rabashkin gave me the privilege of visiting my home, so we were sitting together and schmoozing. So he told me at some point, he said, you know, America is not the Soviet Union. Thank God. And the tortures that we both have grandparents who suffered tremendously under Stalin. And some of them were tortured very badly. So I know the story of his family and he knows mine. So he said the tortures that some of our ancestors went through in Stalinist Russia don't happen here in prison. But you should know that where I was, they try to destroy your humanity. Not through physical torture, but emotional, psychological mechanisms that at some point you don't feel fully human. You lose your sense of dignity. You lose your sense of value. Suddenly you're locked in, and for hours you have to stay in your cell. Why? Nobody knows. Suddenly they inspect everything that you have in every pocket. Azoy, you want to move from one room to another room, scrutiny, you have 5 minutes, and if you lose those 5 minutes, now is lockdown. And then you could be plunged into solitary confinement. All these types of things that psychologically, at some point, you're dehumanized. And this is a very natural process. And he said, I realize it's going to happen to me. I realize that sooner or later this is going to happen to me. I'm going to lose my your sense of humanness. And of course, when that happens, when the person comes out of, even if they come out of prison at some point, they're never the same. So I said, so what did you do? He said, I realized that I have to remain connected to something that's not in prison. I have to remain connected in my mind. I'm in prison physically, but I have to remain connected to something above prison. He said, and that's what the Emunah was. I knew that God is in prison, but he's not confined in prison. He's in prison, he's also out of prison. So by really connecting to him, I remained emotionally unshackled. I remained above the prison even though as I was there. And that's why I could retain my dignity and sense of value and serenity for 8 years. Even though I looked and I knew that this is supposed to break me. I wasn't naive, it's supposed to destroy me. So this awareness of Emunah, when it's internalized, is a very, very powerful tool. Understanding that there's a deeper rhythm and energy in life that a Jew and a human being can always connect to. But now we come to step 2. Now Emunah is ganz good. But there's something called bitachon. Bitachon is what the Tzemach Tzedek was telling this person. He didn't tell him, your child is sick. God did it, accept it. He could have said that. God has his plans. He's very sick. I don't know if he's going to die. He may die. I hope he doesn't. Well, daven. But may happen. May happen. This world is a funny place and it's a painful place. That's not what he told him. He told him, tracht gut wird sein gut. That's where Emunah morphs into bitachon. So you have, for example, the Chazon Ish has a famous booklet called Kovetz Emunah Bitachon. And he argued that bitachon is really the concept of Emunah. It's trusting that mommy knows what she's doing. You know how a little baby trusts mommy, and mommy sometimes takes it to the doctor? You remember the vaccination days? And you tell your husband, next time you're doing this, I'm not doing this. I'm not holding down this baby by 2 arms. This is not a mother's job. I don't look at the bris and I don't do the vaccination. Sorry. It's a father's job. It's good enough that I allow it to happen. And the truth is, it is a painful sight, even though we all understand it. When the baby needs a shot, I'm not getting into the vaccination issue, but let's talk about, I don't mean to open up cans of worms here. Let's talk about another shot to draw blood. Okay. Does that work? Mr. Chadokter, you want to defend me? Okay. So, and you're holding up, the baby looks at you with such innocence and such trust, and then 10 seconds later you're holding down your baby, who's now hollering and screaming. The baby's almost looking at you and saying, Mommy, this relationship is really not going to end the way I wanted it. And you're going to pay for this. Wait till I become a teenager. You're going to pay for this moment. Basically, that's why we teach not to take revenge. And yet you do it. And you do it with the same love that you nurture the child. So this was the Chazon Ish's idea. Bitachon means God is your mother. Let it be. Surrender the expectations that make you frustrated and angry, and understand that You have a God who is responsible for everything in life, and it's out of love. That's where bitachon and Emunah are the same. But the Sefer HaIkrim, the Kad HaKemach, the Maharal, the Zohar, and even a few places in Chovos HaLevavos Shara bitachon, and in other Svarim, there's another dimension of bitachon. And that is that the human being's attitude and the human being's thoughts and feelings and emotions, what we project, actually has a power to impact reality. Ad kedei kach, the Tzemach Tzedek, the same Tzemach Tzedek, writes a letter that his grandfather, the Baal HaTanya, who was one of the greatest sages of Jewish history, died while running away from Napoleon. He did not want to be under Napoleon. Napoleon came in June 1812 to conquer Russia. Napoleon came in from France, he came from Lithuania into Belarus, into Russia. Baal HaTanya lived in Liadi in Belarus, and he escaped into the Ukraine. The winter of 1812 was one of the coldest winters, which was the cause of Napoleon's defeat, and naturally the cause of his death as well. And he passed away in a little town called Piena, Mitzvah Shabbos, Parsha Shmois, Chav Dalet Teves, Chav Gimel, the night of Chav Dalet Teves. And Tzemach Tzedek writes, it's very emotional how he says he was a young man, and his grandfather saw him davening Ma'ariv, and he says this was the last Ma'ariv I davened lifnei misosoi, before his passing, meaning it was Mitzvah Shabbos. He passed away, he writes 10:25 p.m. Tzemach Tzedek writes, my grandfather passed away 10:25. So this was probably a little while earlier, the last Ma'ariv, he says, before his death. And I davened Ma'ariv b'nigun shel Morosh Chayra, in a depressing melody. He did not interrupt me. He waited till I finished davening. And after I finished davening, he told me that the Zohar says, and I want to quote you the Zohar. The Zohar says in Parshas Tetzaveh, I'm going to quote and translate. This is what his Zayd is telling him after he finishes Ma'ariv in a depressing tune. The higher world does not feed into the lower world, only based on the state of the lower world. If the one in the lower world is in a state of positivity and joy and good spirits, so the higher world feeds that energy into the lower world. And if the person is in a state of melancholy and negativity and pessimism, the higher world feeds that into the lower world. It mirrors his or her emotion and thought back to them. And therefore my grandfather said, do not daven with a nigun of depression. And a few minutes later, he returned his soul to its maker. And his grandson writes this as a first document. He writes this in a letter. When he heard from his Zayda, the Baal HaTanya v'Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe, Rebbe Shnei Zalman of Liadi, the author of Shulchan Aruch Harav and the Tanya. This is Chav Dalet Teves, Tovkuf Ayin Gimel. The end of 1812, December 1812, the 24th of Teves, Tovkuf Ayin Gimel in the Hebrew calendar, which is next week, but it was Mitzvah Shabbos Shmois, which is this parsha. What does the Zohar mean? What does it mean? Like what the Maggid says. He told him what the Maggid says also. He heard it from his teacher, the Maggid of Mizrich. The image of God is always the image of the person. I'm going to say it dramatically, I don't mean these words. In other words, there's a certain element of God that we create. Of course, we don't create God, God creates us. But there's a certain flow of divinity that we somehow mold, we craft, we generate. And this is what the Gemara says in Brachas, that this Yehuda gave a krechts, a sigh, and his Rebbe Emunah says, what are you doing? Why are you introducing negativity into your life? What did he do? He krechs. That's what every Jew does. Who doesn't sigh? You're not Jewish. You probably need conversion if you don't sigh. Since when does a Jew display optimism? That's like a Gentile thing to do. But he says, what are you doing? What are you bringing in pain into your life? What are you bringing Yisurim into your life? It's such a sharp response. So this couple gets married and goes on a honeymoon. And they decide that instead of going on a classical, normal honeymoon, they want to be adventurous. So they go to this rustic hut. Right? It's exciting. You feel young, creative, adventurous. Somewhere in the forest. They're in this wooden hut. And they're looking forward to 3 magical, awesome days of love and romance and affection. And as they fall asleep the first night in that wooden, what's the name of it? The wooden cabin. A woodpecker decides to visit them. And the woodpecker had all the time. He was also on a honeymoon. And this became his honeymoon. And he woodpecked away throughout the night and deprived them of even 10 straight minutes of sleep. Okay, one night you could not survive. Fun, exciting day. Exhausted, they go back into bed the second night of the honeymoon in this wooden cabin. And a visitor comes. It wasn't the Schwigger, it was the woodpecker. And the woodpecker is there all night. And the poor couple at this point are going to lose it, but there's still one more day to the honeymoon. And it was difficult for them to look at each other and say, you know, we were stupid. The Ritz-Carlton is probably better. They went back to sleep a third night, and the woodpecker arrived and spent the next 24 hours with them. And finally, it was time to go home. On the way home, they looked at each other, and she tells him, this was an unbelievable, positive honeymoon. It was great. It was awesome. It was special. It was just excellent. Now we have to figure out how. This was a good honeymoon. Mission accomplished. We had the best time. Now we got to figure out how. And together, they created the cartoon known as Woody Woodpecker. This was Walter Lanz and his wife. On the way back of their honeymoon, they created this cartoon based on their experience. 50 years later, they were interviewed by a journalist, and they were asked, what was the best night of your life? And they said, hands down, in the cabin with the woodpecker. It proved to be the best night of our life. Yes, money making as well. That's what made it the best night, I assume. Besides everyone's entertainment of Woody Woodpecker. A simple story, but not such a simple story. If I am examining that night objectively, one could say this was miserable. She blames him, he blames her. They get into the first fight, and they end up the next week at the first therapist before many others about the worst conceivable honeymoon in the world. This idiot is out for lunch, out for breakfast, out for dinner. I told you we don't go to rustic cabins and forests. This you could do with your friends. You could backpack with your friends, but of course he couldn't listen. He had to be adventurous and a cool guy. And look what happened. And she would have been right. You can't argue with her. And a good therapist would say, yeah, I understand. What else? And she would say, and not only that, he's not telling me, let's have a good time. And what else? Objectively, that's a good description. It's pretty objective. They decided on their own to look at it completely differently. They decided to see it positively. And suddenly it became the happiest, most successful night of their life. It guaranteed them a life of prosperity, a life of wealth, a life of broadness, and a life with many blessings for what their ambitions were. I don't know if you ever looked at sailboats. You ever studied sailboats? Sailboats follow the wind. But do they follow the wind? You look at a river, you look at an ocean, one is going south, one is going north. The wind is not the factor. It's the direction of the sails. Life has lots of winds. The sails represent your thoughts. So you have one person subjected to the same winds like the other person. The winds are the tsunamis of the world. Life is stressful. Listen to my genius observation. Life is stressful. If it's not, you can get out right now and that's fine. And give us the recipe, maybe you'll make money like another Woody Woodpecker. Or I should say, not life is stressful. Life brings on many events that could be very stressful. I think everybody can agree with that. And the older you get, and the more involved you get, one sees this. Especially as you raise a family, and you raise children, and you watch those children suddenly grow up from 2, when they were the cute little angels. Even though they're terrorists, then they're also angels. And you forgive anything, and then things develop, and every day there's a new parsha. And especially if you were blessed with a child who is like the woodpecker, but not for 3 nights. Sometimes for 3 months, sometimes for 3 years, and sometimes more, and you're not sure when the roof will finally collapse as a result of the woodpecker. The winds are very powerful, but the sails of the boat, those are our thoughts, our machshavos, how we process those experiences. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, based on the Zohar, tracht gut, wird sein gut. Think good and it will be good. But now the obvious question is, what does that really mean? Tzemach Tzedek told it to a father whose child was ill. It wasn't a small parsha. It wasn't only an issue in a job, or an issue in a house, or an issue in school, or an issue in your own personal life, some struggle. It was an objective, challenging, threatening life and death reality. Is it responsible to tell that to somebody? Is it irresponsible to tell it to somebody? A Jew is sighing. Reb Hamnuna says, why do you want to bring pain into your life? You would think maybe you should ask him, what's bothering you? Why are you sighing? Well, he probably knew him very well, and he was ready to challenge him very deeply. So, I want to try to explain this a little bit. It's going to sound a little strange, which is fine, because life is strange. Now, I just don't want you to shut down when I start my explanation, because it's a little complicated. But if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, I think you'll see where I'm going. I'm going to ask a stupid question. When a tree falls in the forest, does it make a noise or not? Somebody once asked me a question, if I state an opinion in the forest and my wife is not there, am I wrong? I told him, you're an idiot because you think she doesn't know your opinion because she's not there. She snuffs out your opinion. Of course you're wrong. That tree falls in the forest. If I was there, I would hear a loud noise. Does it make a noise? Someone say, well, what's the difference? The tree fell, it makes a noise, and why are you getting so philosophical and it's irrelevant? It is relevant because the answer is not so simple. The noise that a tree makes when it falls on the ground, or it falls on a car, or it falls down, that noise is a combination of 2 things. It's the vibrations created by the tree's fall and my eardrums. It's the marriage of my eardrums and the falling of the tree, the vibrations created by the tree, that creates this noise that we say, oh, I just heard a tree fall. If my eardrums are not there, it's a very different experience. Well, let's now go one step deeper. There are physicists today, especially physicists who are dedicated to the field of what's known as quantum theory or quantum mechanics, which is modern physics, who will say the following statement. It sounds meshuggah. It is a little meshuggah, but this is a statement. When I leave my house for the summer and I go away, the house is not there. The house disappears. Now you'll say, meshuggah. The house doesn't disappear. The house is there. How do I know? The fire alarm went off. And there's a leak. What do you mean the fire, the house disappears? Anybody who walks by sees the house is there. But let's explain what that means. When I see a house, when I'm looking at my house or anything I'm looking at, there's two things that are happening. What I see is always a marriage of two realities. The objective reality of what I'm looking at and my perception of that reality. And it's my perception of that reality coupled with the reality of what I'm looking at that creates the vision, the reality that I see. Let me give you an example that a physicist once gave. Heisenberg wrote this. I gave you once this example, but it's very relevant here. A fisherman takes a net, lowers it into the Pacific Ocean for a few months, lifts up the net and declares that there's no fish in the Pacific Ocean smaller than 6 inches. Everybody is laughing. In your dining room, you have a fish tank with goldfish or starfish that are 3 inches, 2 inches. How can a researcher say that there's no fish smaller than 6 inches? And he swears that he's sane and he's accurate. And Heisenberg said, of course, you know why? The holes in the net were 6 inches. So the holes in the net can only capture fish that are larger than 6 inches. Any fish that are smaller fall through the hole. They can't be captured by the net. In other words, the instruments you use to determine reality will define the reality that you determine through those instruments. You got that? Good. But very often I don't look at those instruments. I say this is reality. Because it takes a lot of depth and courage to look at the instruments you're using to define reality. The instruments we never challenge, but really you have to look, what are the instruments you're using to define reality? Maybe that is what is defining the reality that's coming to you. Because it's based on those instruments, and those instruments can only capture a certain reality. So here's the question. What is a house on its own? Forget a house. What is this cup on its own? Not me looking at it. I know what I see. I see a styrofoam cup with cold coffee inside. I don't see the coldness, but I tasted it. I see an iPhone. I see a laptop. I see a video camera. I see a skinny guy in the camera. I see a crowd. I see a tent. Oh, you just got that? Okay. I just said, trach gut wird sein gut. These are all realities. But now, what is this cup really objectively? If nobody's looking, what is this cup? Modern physics, and this is secular physics, this doesn't have to do with religion. Modern scientists will tell you that if you can penetrate and observe what we call the molecular structure that makes up every matter, every single thing in the world, if you can go deeper and see the atomic structure of every single piece of matter in our entire planet, from a blade of grass to your pinky, from this styrofoam cup to a video camera, from the human body to a blade of grass to a worm to a frog. And if you can go deeper and see the particles that make up the atom, what we call subatomic particles. There you come across what they call today in quantum physics uncertainty principles, where matter is basically acting paradoxical. Subatomic particles are moving clockwise and counterclockwise simultaneously. They behave as waves and they behave as particles. A basketball, dribbling a basketball, and it's moving right here, and on a subatomic level, it's also moving somewhere else. So you tell me this doesn't make sense. That's not true. A basketball is here, it's not here. And I tell you, they will tell you, it's your observation of it that causes it to collapse into one mode because you see it a certain way, and that makes it a certain way. My eyes, my perception of the reality will cause it to collapse into a particular state that is solid, absolute, fixed, and rigid. When I leave my house, it reverts back to what it is. You know what it is? A realm of crazy, infinite possibilities. When I look at the house, my eyes, together with the objective reality, create this reality called the house. So what is this house? It's not an objective reality. It's the objective reality married to my perception of the reality. And my perception of the reality, what my eyes say I see, based on the abilities of my net, of my instruments, it causes it to collapse from a wave into a particle. There's no uncertainty anymore. There's no paradox anymore. It's a fixed, solid model. And in physics, they had to understand, how does every object graduate from something that is so filled with contradictions to something that is so fixed? And it's the observation of the person, the perception that makes it that way. Which means, very practically, two people could be living in the same world and looking at the same thing, but it's a different thing for each of them. And just as it is in very practical, two people are sitting at a Shabbos table, same Shabbos table. One person is miserable. You know, when you're in a bad mood, you're miserable. One person is happy. One person sees the fish, it's like, wow. One person sees a child jumping on the couch, wow, it's so cute. And the other person is living in a miserable state, and the house is a miserable place. And who's right? You can have two people sitting in the same dining room, a husband and a wife. One is in a jolly mood, one is in a miserable mood. Usually they don't know why the other one is in that mood. He's just giving you an attitude, or you're giving him an attitude. It's usually whatever. He's clueless or you're clueless. Everyone is in the same world. What you see as the curse, he sees as a blessing, or what he sees as a curse, you see as a blessing. So that's psychologically. But it's not just psychologically, it's also scientifically. So when I leave my house, it reverts back to what it is, the realm of possibilities. When I look at it, my eyes, my perception of what it is, together with what it is, creates that reality. There's a famous physicist, his name is Max Planck. He won the Nobel Prize for quantum theory. He's involved in quantum theory. He won the Nobel Prize for physics. He once said, I'm not saying it verbatim, but something like this I read. He said, fascinating line. Consciousness is not a derivative of matter. Matter is a derivative of consciousness. It is unscientific to say that there are any physical fixed laws to the universe. It's all a matter of consciousness. You get it? Consciousness is not born from matter. Matter is born from consciousness. And therefore, to say there's a fixed law is unscientific. You can't say that as a reality, because it's my consciousness of the law that creates the law. It's the fact that I say, this is how it has to be, that creates it. Talking about cartoons. There's one cartoon, some of you probably remember it well. Maybe Taka, which is that foolish bird? The Roadrunner. Thank you. The Roadrunner is fighting with a coyote. Here's the Yankasa. And the Roadrunner outsmarts the coyote, and as the coyote's chasing it, and it comes to the edge of a cliff, the Roadrunner hides behind one of the rocks, and the coyote, unbeknownst of what's going on, is so impassioned and angry that it just continues, not realizing it just jumped over the cliff. Now, I'm sorry for analyzing a cartoon based on quantum theory or Kabbalistic or Hasidic ideas, but I'll do it anyway. Because sometimes these simple stuff capture deep ideas. And the coyote continues to walk on mid-air. And it walks and walks and it's running and running on. And then at some point it's looking for the Roadrunner. And the Roadrunner, of course, not here. So the coyote turns around and sees from far away the edge of a cliff. And it looks at itself and it sees it's in mid-air. And then it looks down and it sees the distance. And it goes, whoa! And at that moment, it falls. Until it did not realize that it has to fall, it actually didn't fall. Until it did not subject itself to the tyranny of gravity, gravity did not rule it. The moment it perceived gravity, it said, oh my God, I'm supposed to fall. Oh yes, there you go. The laws of nature are not written in stone. They're written in our minds. You read, you all grew up, splitting of the sea. Avram Avinu thrown into fire and didn't get burnt. A lot of people struggle with these stories. What happened exactly? So you say if God wants to split a sea, he splits a sea. That's true, but it's much deeper than that. You're talking about a miracle-minded person. A miracle-minded person is a spiritual quantum theorist who understands that the laws of nature are written in our mind. So it's our mind that defines nature, not nature that defines our minds. For most of us, it's the charisma of nature that defines our minds. When Avraham Avinu walked into that place, his mind defined nature. And nature responded. Nature responded to his understanding that if God creates the world every moment, the fire won't burn him. God will decide what will happen with him. In uncertainty principles, the water splits also. But we look at it and we say, oh my God! Nachshon ben Aminadab, his mind was different. Because his mind was different, the sea responded. So the Tzemach Tzedek tells this Jew, Tracht gut, wird sein gut. The thinking good itself is a tremendous, tremendous avodah. It's the ability to be able to say that reality is not fixed. Reality is a dynamic creation every single moment by the divine, and there's a marriage between you and reality at every single moment. So you could walk into your house, it's supper time, it's absolute chaos, as is the minhag in a good, healthy, vibrant Jewish home. And you start pitting yourself. You start pitting the children who are growing up with a mother who's pitting her children and herself. You pity your home, you pity the atmosphere, you pity dinner. Every moment there's a new fight. Suddenly you become a mediator, a judge, a psychologist, a counselor. And every moment there's another crisis. This one hit this one. And the more agitated, of course, the more chaos and disarray in the home. Now, these are objective realities. When your son hit your daughter, what is quantum mechanics going to say? tell your son, oh, it's really an uncertainty principle. But here is where miracle-minded consciousness actually takes place. Somebody could place their mind into a very positive space. This is not about repressing emotions. It has nothing to do with it. Tracht gut does not mean make believe. Life is wonderful. It's not la la land. I could be very honest with the struggle and with all of my experience. But then I choose to view the world from a much deeper place in me. From a divine place in which nature is just a flow of divine energy. And over there things are really not fixed. And my thoughts of reality, it's not just it'll put you in a better mood or it'll give you denial for another few days. It has an impact on the fabric of reality. Reality responds. Today a lot of people talk about the secret, right? The secret, the law of attraction. Some say it's absolute lunacy, and some swear by it. The law of attraction, this is New Age stuff. You may have read the book, you may have seen documentaries. The law of attraction, The Secret, bestsellers. And it basically tells you, they like to say, the universe has hidden intelligence. And it responds to you. And if you project positive energy, it responds to you. But 2,000 years before this, the Zohar says the higher world feeds into the lower world based on the state of the lower world. So the Baal HaTanya tells it, Tzemach Tzedek, don't sing a niggin of depression by Ma'ariv. You don't realize the power of your thoughts, of your attitudes. You could look at your child and see failure, misery, agony, a life destined to self-destructiveness. And you'll have all the data to back it up. You're not in denial. And you shouldn't be in denial of the facts and the struggles the person is going through. Or you could go into the depth of reality of yourself and of your child and of the world and really imagine and create very powerful, positive energy and attitude and feelings and thoughts about this very child. And you may be shocked of the results, not only in your mind, but in reality. The same is true with your marriage. The same is true with your children. The same is true with health. The same is true, most importantly, with your whole attitude. Your mental state, physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, relationship to other people. Even when I struggle with stuff, and I struggle with pain, and some struggle with abuse, and some struggle with difficult questions that are not easily answered. Tracht gut means understand that this reality that comes across with such, comes across and creates so much turmoil, and so much misery, and so much agony, and so much pain. If I could truly tune into that reality, and generate within myself an attitude of tracht gut, of thinking positively about this very reality, this has an impact sometimes beyond what most people can imagine. And that's why the Baal Shem Tov says that when Hashem, it's unbelievable words of the Baal Shem Tov, if something negative is supposed to happen to a person, the first thing God has to do is take away his bitachon. Because if God doesn't take away his bitachon, it won't be able to happen. Because he is the ruler of destiny. He has to put in this negative, hopeless, desperate attitude. Oh, I'm supposed to fall. Of course. I'm supposed to fall. And the bird falls, and the coyote falls. Falls right there. So the Maggid says, the divine energy is mamash a picture of me. It's a Mara Adam, the Muska Mara Adam Alav Mamayla. The image that I reflect, what do I mean by image? It means the physical image, but it also means my entire persona. It creates the divine flow. I look at reality in a certain way, that is reality. I look at it a different way, that is reality. I don't know if I should quote him in this shir, but Henry Ford once said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. You think you can't, you're right. You think you can, you're also right. They say this guy was a very big pessimist. And he always told everybody, especially his wife, how he's destined to misery. And he goes and he was responsible for loading trains that transported foods on large journeys. And once he loaded a train with dairy, yogurts and ice cream and cheese and butter and milk. And it was a long trip to Vancouver, some 30 hours or 40 hours by train. And it was, of course, supposed to be refrigerated because it's dairy. And he goes in and he finishes loading it, and he's about to leave, and the doors closed, and the train goes, and he's banging, and nobody hears him, and his cell phone is dead, of course. And he realizes that for the next 40 hours, he will be in a refrigerator, which means a freezer, in a freezer, not a refrigerator. And that means he will freeze to death. And he takes out a pen, and he finds a piece of cardboard, and he writes his final will to his wife and children. And he, of course, begins and he says, my dear wife, I always knew that something like this will happen to me. I always expected that this would be my end. My whole life was miserable. My death is miserable. I am miserable. And maybe when you get rid of this miserable guy, maybe you guys can have some days of happiness. And he goes on lamenting how his life from beginning, middle, end was nothing but an exercise in infinite agony and savage suffering. And the train arrives in Vancouver. The doors open. They start unloading dairy, and they see there's a man in a faint, in a comatose state. And they schlep him right away to the hospital, and they revive him. And the doctor tries to figure out what happened. He can't understand because the freezer was off. Sometimes, sadly, there's an inner voice in us, in some of us, that tells us, who am I to be happy? Who am I to have a successful marriage? Who am I to be potent, wholesome? Who am I to live a powerful life? Who am I to be gorgeous, physically, emotionally, spiritually? Who am I to be a success story? Who am I to be a source of love and light and hope to myself, to my loved ones, to my friends, to people around the world? Who am I to make a real change in the world? Not me. I'm the loser. I'm the nerd. I'm the quintessential loser. I was told so implicitly and explicitly. Nasty people told it to me explicitly, and everybody else told it to me implicitly. And I tell it to myself every day. And those thoughts are so responsible for so much of our reality. But we never challenge them because we always have objective proof. There are no fish smaller than 6 inches. Did you ever think of changing your net? Now, it's not easy to change a net. If I'm holding the same net for 45 years, or 25 years, or 65 years, the same net, and everything in the world gets measured with this net, somebody suddenly tells me Tuesday morning, throw away the stupid net. Throw it away, sell it on eBay, and it's not worth 99 cents. Throw it away, take a different net. And the other net is tracht gut. You are an ambassador of the divine. Your soul is a chelik eloka mimal, as the Baal HaTanya says, mamish, a fragment of Hashem. Your soul is invincible, it's impeccable, it's flawless, it's one with the divine. You're an ambassador of love, light, and hope. You're part of a cosmos that is recreated every single moment anew with a dynamic reality, and nature is a manifestation of divine energy. And therefore I go to the world seeing the divine in it. and understanding the divine is good, and therefore there's no fixed reality. And therefore I think positively. I think positively because I'm in the bosom of an infinite creator who embraces me and loves me every moment. That is my bosom, that is my paradigm. And therefore I think positive. Says the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek, tracht gut, vet sein gut. That creates goodness. And all this is not it's not easy, even though it's sometimes easier than we think it is. Because part of our thoughts are saying, this is not for me. I'm a realist. But I'm talking to you reality. I'm just talking to you not about superficial reality. I'm talking about the depth of reality. You could look at superficial reality and say, this is a cup. Any scientist will laugh at you. This is no cup. Just like you could look at this and say, this is just a body. What about the 100 trillion cells recreating themselves? What about the 100 million neurons making 100 million decisions every moment? There's so much life, there's so much dynamism, there's so much interactivity in every flower, in every blade of grass. You could look at a bird flying and melt in ecstasy. There's infinity unfolding right there in front of your eyes. I woke up early, I was up very early this morning, like, I don't know, it was 5 in the morning, and I went to the window. And today is, what's today? Tesvav, right? So it's the 15th day of the month. The 15th day of the month, the sun rises in the east, and the moon, on Rosh Chodesh, the moon and the sun are in the same angle, the same direction. In the middle of the month, it's the opposite, which is why we have the full moon. So I look out the window, and the sun was not rising yet. And the moon was on one side, the moon was on the west, and the sun was on the east. And I just saw the whole ball of the moon. I see it often, but suddenly I looked at it and I said to myself, this is not random. That synchronization, that perfection, to say this is random seemed so ludicrous to me emotionally and intellectually. But it's so easy to live through life and become fixed and rigid in a particular net and not sense the flow of every single moment. Part of the concealment of the world is that it doesn't want us to see a flow. It just wants us to see everything rigid, boxed in. What was, must be. What is, will be. All of Judaism is a meditation on change, transformation, infinite possibility, and hope. But to underscore the profound courage that this takes, the Torah adds one depiction about our first and greatest teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu. And that is, a Jew looks at him and says, who made you judge? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? The Torah says Moshe became terrified. Not only in his mind, but he even verbalized it. Sometimes it's in my mind, and it's part of my reality. He verbalized it. Now here we see the uniqueness of how the words are constructed. Vayomer, he says, Achei noida hadavar. The thing was known. It's not a thing, he killed them, but the Torah calls it the thing. Vayishma paroi es hadavar hazeh. The next scene is, Paroi hears it. Moshe's fear, Moshe's trepidation, Moshe's pessimism relative to his madrega, relative to his lofty level. That is what created the vibe in the world. That Paroi actually hears it. Paroi picks up that energy. He picks up that vibe. Paroi seeks to kill him. So the Torah here, as a unique exception to the rule, introduces an emotion that seemingly living in a vacuum. It didn't produce consequences. It produced major consequences. Moshe hears what this Jew tells him, and his mind says, this is bad. This is trouble. This is a disaster. This is the end of me. And he verbalizes it. The Torah doesn't say Vayomer beliboy like it says in other places. Vayomer, he says it. And when we verbalize something, we give it even more concrete power. An absolute power. A certain absoluteness. And he says, Achei noida hadavar. And that creates the energy. Vayishma Parai. On one level, Parai heard the news. Somebody told him. On another level, Parai heard that fear. That fear translated, ultimately, into a domino effect, which creates Parai experiencing it. So, sometimes a person has a struggle with tracht gut, with thinking positive. It's hard. But sometimes I won't verbalize it. Sometimes the struggle is so deep, I start saying how bad it is. It comes into dibur. From that dibur of Moshe, from the words of Moshe, how terrible it is. Because it's known, and what's going to happen here? Parai picks it up. The atmosphere that's created in the world is a vibe that Parai picks up as a result. And he pursues Moshe. And Moshe runs away, and history takes on a different narrative. Because people's choices are all intertwined with how history develops. When a person tracht gut, if Moshe might have thought, the Jew won't inform on me. He's telling me he won't inform on me. He's not now in a state of desperation of fear. The results in reality may have been different. And that is why the Gemara says, when Yehuda starts kvetching, Reb Emunah tells him, what's this all about? You're now going into a pessimistic state. You're going into a negative state. You're now looking at your life and saying, Oy! You're creating now a reality for yourself. It says you should be scared. That's when it comes to Torah. You always have to be deliberate and never become pompous and arrogant. There you need fear. There you need caution. You always have to say, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm making a mistake, let me review it again. Honesty is the key when you want to be a teacher of Torah. Intellectual integrity, emotional integrity. But what's this asnach? The sna, the sigh, the krecht, the zifts. That's what he's telling him. Consistent exactly with what the Zohar teaches in Parshas Tetzaveh, that the lower world and the higher world mirror each other. And when I open up to the higher world with a countenance of positive energy, it generates an entirely new flow from the higher world into the lower world. Have a wonderful week.
Is it a push button that we're going to get the result?
It's not about guilt, and it's not about judging why sometimes it happened, it didn't happen, what they were thinking, what they were not thinking. I don't think we should be making these calculations. I think for each of us to make calculations for other people, what they were thinking, were they really thinking, were they not thinking, or to feel guilty about how we thought. I don't think, fine, fine, I got it. I don't know that we're capable of making these calculations. The mysteries of life and the world and death are really beyond us. You know what I mean? Nobody understands God's ways in this world. It's so mysterious. A finite creator doesn't understand an infinite God, much less than a frog understands black holes or modern physics, much less. I think the message is to us internally in our own lives.
Okay, it just gets confusing to me, right?
Well, that's the first concept of Emunah. Emunah means that this is what life gave me, and it's what Hashem gave me. So it's not a curse. It's an opportunity. Whatever it is, it may be difficult, it may be painful. Emunah means that I'm in the hands of God, and this is the life that God gave me, and therefore it's good. It's not evil. The Mishnah says, Chayev Adam levarech ala rag shem shemevarech ala tova, meaning a person has to be able to look at life and say, this is not bad. It may look bad, it's quite a headache, it's emotionally draining, but if I could look deeper, it's not bad. I don't have a bad life, I have a good life. I have a good life, I have to discover it. That's That's very powerful. I know. I'm explaining the class. That's a very powerful step. That's the first step.
Moshe grew up in Paro's house from when he was a baby. He wasn't.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that he was a Jew. You know.
Well, listen. Yocheved nursed him, right? She nursed him, so
When you nurse, like you could take anything.
probably at some point they communicated. Yeah?
And this is who you are. Just
Physics is incredible. And I just want to say thank
there's a
you.
lot of physicists.
The question is the relationship between consciousness and that.
Yes.
How do you balance that with needing to speak about things that are like weighing on you and eating you up inside?
A good question. Speaking about it is fine. Defining ourselves based on those words is the issue.
Like judging the ourselves in the situation.
In other words, where those words become the defining barometer of reality. We carry within ourselves a side that tends to go pessimistic. And we have to acknowledge that.
Feeling X, Y, or Z is to say what we feel.
This is a part, right. But I'm not going to allow reality to be defined by that, including my reality. I may have very depressing trends within my brain. I mean, we all know that.
Sometimes the thing that's bothering us is the fact that we're afraid of something, and even
We don't have to be afraid of that. Yeah, yeah, it is what it is. We're naming it to get rid of it. We're naming it not to get rid of it, to quarantine it. We're naming it to isolate it. We're naming it to say, okay, it is. And now I can choose how to think. It's the other way around. Sometimes you speak about something, yeah, in order to liberate yourself from that thing. That's good. By not speaking about it, those depressing thoughts overtake my reality. By speaking about it, I say, okay, this is something in me that is. It's a black, Churchill said, a black dog that barks. Okay, bark. But I'm not that. If I don't address it, I become that. So it allows me actually to create a barrier, to create a partition. Here we're talking about something else. The fear takes me over. You get it?
Yeah, I think so. What about situation where like someone
in danger and you're like, oh, now it's happening?
No. If I'm sitting in a room and a lion comes in, I have to run. That fear is good. If I'm top of a bridge, I should be afraid to jump. That's good. You understand what I'm saying? This doesn't mean a person doesn't, if a person, yeah, bitachon doesn't mean you don't go to the doctor and you don't do what you have to do naturally. Hashem wants us to work in teva. That's part of Hashem's will. Bitachon doesn't mean I ignore nature and I jump off the cliff and I say, oh, there's no gravity. First of all, I don't believe it, right? So you have to be, But you understand what I'm saying? So a person has to do al pi teva. And if al pi teva, there's a reason to be scared. For example, one second, I'm on top of a roof and I don't want to jump because I'm afraid. That's a good fear. You get what I'm saying?
what about like the way that people will name cancer? Is that like, what is that like?
I don't know. Probably superstition. That's probably superstition. Ich weiß. It's frightening for people. I don't know if it's connected.
Okay, thank you.
Huh? In other words, to say that a person should go jump, that's it. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to al pi Torah. I'm not allowed to walk in front of a car. I'm not allowed to cut my finger and say, trach gut wird sein gut. The same God says you have to work in teva. You have to do a shtadlus al pi teva. This happened with Moshe Rabbeinu already. Something happened in the past. The question is, how is he going to look at the reality? Is he going to say, it's just going really bad? Or no, it's not going bad. It's good. Direction. Direction of your sailboat. Thinking good doesn't mean you don't take action to change your reality.
Right, we create our own reality.
It's not a contradiction. Thinking good doesn't mean to be passive. Somebody else asked me.
I think that's how we
Thinking good doesn't mean somebody's punching me in my nose. Good never means be passive. Somebody's punching me in my nose, yeah? I'm bleeding. And they punch. Yeah? I say, trach gut. It'll be positive. It'll be good. It'll be wonderful.
Try that.
The guy's abusing you. You got to stop. He's punching me in the nose. I got to run away or punch him back in the nose and call the police. A person, chas v'shalom, is sick. You don't say, I don't go to the doctor. Person has an infection. I don't take medicine. Trachgut. The same God who recreates the world every moment and is not fixed by nature says, you need to make a keli b'derech hateva for Hashem's hashpah. It's against Torah, against Hashem's will to say, I'm a passive person, everything will be good. Yes. Trachgut means don't limit your thoughts. Don't confine your thoughts into a mode of a miserable future, a miserable destiny.
This class is brought to you by the yeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.